We're going to spend our time talking about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We actually, in this class, have to step backwards a little bit and talk about Dred Scott. Dred Scott is a significant player in this discussion because, well, the whole idea of, dang it, I just threw my clicker in the garbage. No. The whole idea of slave trade and the way slavery looks in America hinges on the outcome of the Dred Scott trial that we're about to take a look at. And then, just like we talked about on Friday, the plan is you guys will be taking your test on Thursday. So we have today. We should be able to finish, or really close to finish, everything that needs to be done. And then you're going to take your test on Thursday. We will review a little bit before you take your test, but we'll be all wrapped up with this chapter before we head off for a nice long spring break, and then we don't have anything hanging over our head. And when we come back, we can start up in chapter 16, which is the Civil War. Rather fascinating time in history, and I kind of enjoy teaching it. So make sure your study guide is complete, not almost complete, but complete, and that you're ready for your test. I did tell you on Friday if there was anything we couldn't do on the study guide, I would tell you. I went through it this morning, and I believe everything on the study guide will have been covered. And if it hasn't been covered, it's like the last slide, which we should be able to get to today. Google it. Now, having said that, I've graded your class's set of John Brown worksheets. They are posted. There were 3 of you that never turned one in, and you have zeros. You need to turn it in so you don't have zeros. It's silly on a worksheet that takes 5 minutes to not do it. You cannot pass my class if you're not doing the work that's asked of you. So some of you have gone from having really good grades a couple of weeks ago to failing because you've just taken a few weeks off. So grades are posted. You can look them up in Nepsis. You can see where you're at. You can see what you got. Most of you on the John Brown worksheet did a really good job. A few of you maybe took a few too many liberties in shortening your answers, or you didn't read the question and you didn't answer it completely. But really, most of it was a 13-point worksheet, and I'll bet you of the 25 of you in here, 20 of you probably got a 12 or a 13. So that's okay. And the 12s, I wish you would have got 13s, but I'm not disappointed in nearly perfect. You missed 1 or 2 things. So stay caught up, get caught up. If you're missing stuff, come and talk to me. Don't just expect me to come find you, because I won't. You are the end of your 8th grade year. Your grades tell you what you're missing. If it says 0, I don't have it. If you're sure you turned it in and it still says 0, there are 5 classes of that worksheet that I still haven't graded. There's a possibility that it's with the wrong class, but it's not likely. So you take care of your responsibilities and get that done. Okay. I'm going to do unfreeze here, and this is going to take us to another quote. I'm stuck in quotes today, but I really like this one. Uses some old school language. Okay, this is an Abraham Lincoln quote. He says, "I'm the big buck of this lick. If any of you want to try it, come on and wet your horns." Okay, there's words in here that don't make any sense to us, but they would have made sense 150 years ago. I'm the big buck of this lick. What do you think Abraham Lincoln is saying? I'm the big dog here. What is a lick?
Like a place.
An area. Now, you can figure that out from the context of the quote, but as you're thinking about, why does he call it a lick? Why not, I'm the big buck of this county? Or I'm the big buck of Blair. Don't mess with me. It does sound pretty cool. It sounds kind of homey, like a guy living in the woods all of his life and growing up not around a lot of people. So I Googled it because I was curious, what's the connection to a lick? In the country, there are naturally occurring places called salt licks. A salt lick attracts animals because animals need a certain amount of salt in their diet. There's actually one on my property. I've never understood it because we could be in the middle of a drought in the middle of summer and it hasn't rained for weeks, and there's this one spot. It's not even in a low spot. It's kind of on the side of a hill that's always wet. And I still don't know why point in time, there was a spring on my land, and it fed a small pond. There was a dam. I wish it was still there, but the dam is there, but there's no water feeding anymore. So I almost wonder if there's just a little bit of water seeping out of the ground right there in that one spot. But it is a natural salt lick. So if you go back to, it's an area about the size of 2 or 3 of these desks. If you go back to that part of my property at any given time, especially after a rain, you can see hoof prints and footprints of every different animal in the whole area that's come there to lick that mud. They're getting salt out of the ground. So a lick is a gathering place for animals. So if Abraham Lincoln walks into a bar, a saloon, and says, I'm the big buck of this lick, I'm the big dog here. Or a school, I'm the big buck of this lick, don't mess with me. If you want to try it, come on and wet your horns. This one sounds like a deer buck that dips his horns in the water, but notice wet is spelled wrong. W-H-E-T.
Maybe it's different meaning.
It is. So just because I'm a curious guy, actually spent years and years and years thinking Abraham Lincoln just doesn't know how to spell wet, or whoever wrote the quote. No, wet, W-H-E-T, means to sharpen. So if 2 bucks are going to fight, bucks do this all the time. They rub their antlers on trees. They polish them up and they sharpen them. So in the spring, when deer antlers start to grow, because they fall off every year, they're covered in like a carpet. It's called velvet. And then they rub that on the trees and they get it off, and then their horns get bigger and they sharpen them, and every year they get a little bit bigger. And eventually what happens to the big buck of the lick?
He gets shot.
Gets shot or gets old and weak. For most of you, even if you're looking at your dad and you're like, my dad's old and he's fat and he's out of shape, most of you at your age still can't take your dad. Even if he's old now, she'll look at me. Okay, now given, my son's not very big, but he still can't take me. Will there come a point in time when he can? That I won't be the big buck in my house, in my league. Of course there will. There will be a point in time when you can take your dad. I say that, my father's 80 years old. He lives in a assisted living facility with my mother, and he can barely stand up off of the couch by himself. I'm fairly certain I can take him. But when I stick my hand out to shake my dad's hand, that old man has a grip on it that could crush my hand. It's like, how are you so... He has no muscles left. He's just deteriorating, and he's old. Your bodies aren't made to be 80 years old. We just survived past that. Looking at 2 presidential candidates in that age range, right? they're maybe not as bad a shape as my father. They're both actually in much better shape than my father, but he's still tough. Can I take him? Yes. But up until about 15 years ago, I don't think I could, which is crazy because 15 years ago, I was in pretty good shape. So the thing that's kind of cool about Abraham Lincoln, nobody really liked to mess with him. He was considered a wrestler. Abraham Lincoln's version of wrestling probably was closer to what we today call MMA, mixed martial arts. It's more like a brawl. But he's the only U.S. president to be admitted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. Of all of these 46, he's the only one in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, the only wrestler. His record as a wrestler, 300 wins, 1 loss.
Dang.
One dude beat him. That's a pretty bad dude if he only lost once. Now, he wasn't a high school wrestler. In fact, he didn't attend high school. Abraham Lincoln had 1 year of formal education and no college. So of all of these men up here, it's pretty safe to say that most of them are very well educated. All of them have a high school education, and most of them had some college education, with the exception of a few of the old timers. Abraham Lincoln had none of that. He was a professional. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's not like our kind of wrestling where you guys, the boys are going to go off and wrestle Gretna today? Gretna Aspen today. It's not like that. No, what he did as a young man is his buddies would take him around the countryside, and they'd go like from town to town or from bar to bar, and they'd walk in with Abraham Lincoln, who is freakishly gigantic. I'll talk about that in a minute also. And they'd say, our man here is the big dog. Anyone want to challenge him? And of course, if you walk into the saloon in Tacoma, there's someone in Tacoma that thinks they're the big dog there. So they're like, oh yeah, we can take this guy. Abraham Lincoln is 6'4" tall, but he weighs 180 pounds. 180 pound, 6'4" tall man is skinny. That's like bones. So he doesn't really look that intimidating. So he's got takers from all over the place. But his buddies knew how tough he was. He's freakishly strong. So they go out into the courtyard, or maybe even if there's room in the tavern, and they fight. And Abraham Lincoln's buddies bring what little money they had, and they bet on Lincoln to win. So it's sort of like a boxing match. There's lots of money bet on boxing matches. That's what's called MMA. There's lots of money involved there. And the winners usually get something. So Abraham Lincoln destroys everyone until he runs into an opponent named Jack Armstrong. Jack Armstrong was a pretty tough guy. And it said that their wrestling match, lasted somewhere in the ballpark of an hour. And they're basically just dancing around in sort of what I would say is maybe a boxing/wrestling stance. And at one point, Jack Armstrong was kind of tired of this traditional style, so he took his foot, and they're not wearing wrestling shoes, they're wearing boots, and he reaches over and he stomps with the heel of his boot right on the middle of Abraham Lincoln's foot. Yeah, that would hurt. So Lincoln's like hopping up and down, and he falls over, and Jack Armstrong defeats the mighty Abraham Lincoln. And immediately, Abraham Lincoln's like, ow, dang it, that hurt. Immediately, Abraham Lincoln's boys are angry, so they get up to attack Jack Armstrong. They're getting ready to beat the snot out of the guy that beat. Unfair or fair, doesn't matter. There weren't really any rules in this fighting. They're getting ready to beat him up. Lincoln stands up with his sore foot, and he tells his boys to back off. This man beat him fair and square. Which also tells us a little bit about the character of Abraham Lincoln. He's able to lose gracefully. He doesn't lose very often, but he can do it gracefully. Lincoln and Jack Armstrong, the only man to ever beat him, later become best friends. So again, there's a little bit about the character there. If you're an athlete, you might hate your opponent while you're opposing them. Like, I use wrestling as an example a lot because it's been a big part of my life pretty much forever. But I know Tannen has a lot of kids that he's enemies when he's on the mat wrestling them, but then afterward, it takes a while, win or lose, it takes a while before you get along. They're running around together. They're buddies. They respect each other. They're friends on Insta. They're friends on Snapchat because they've got a relationship outside of the mat that allows them to get along. There's a mutual respect for each other. If you're good enough to defeat me, I don't need to hate on you. We can be friends. In fact, if I'm your friend, it gives me an opportunity to learn what your weaknesses are so that maybe next time I can defeat you. So there's tactics involved here, but this guy's a tough guy. Abraham Lincoln's not one to be messed with. Yes?
I mean, Google search and it said Hank Thompson.
Hank Thompson? It could be. I mean, I was wrong once, or I thought I was wrong once, but I was mistaken. This is Dred Scott. So we're taking a step backwards. My White Day class yesterday got through this, but I remembered then that we had a shorter class on Friday, so we didn't get to Dred Scott. So I'm going to give you the shorter, simplified version of this. Dred is a slave. This is him in the picture. This is a big case. Dred is originally owned by a family named the Peter Blow family. Peter Blow was a city guy that moved to Alabama to try to farm. To us today, this sounds ridiculous. For a city guy just to buy up some land and try to become a farmer, yeah, that's not a thing. But for Peter Blow, it was. At that time, it was. You could get free land or really cheap land in the country. What the heck? I'm going to go be a farmer. It doesn't really work that way today. If you're going to be a farmer, it almost means that your dad has to already own the land, or your mom. Or you could become a farmer by, if you really wanted to go work for a farmer for years and years and years, And then after you've done that, maybe you get an opportunity to rent a piece of land, and you can maybe get a deal with your boss to borrow some equipment, because all of that stuff is crazy expensive. You'd have to be a multi-millionaire to be able to afford to get started. So Peter Blow tries farming, and he's got a field hand, Dred Scott, but he fails. By the way, while working for Peter Blow, Dred Scott falls in love with a young woman, a teenage girl.
Say what?
Well, that's not weird yet. Until I tell you, because you say a little too young, until I tell you that Dred Scott was born in 1800, he falls in love with a teenage girl in 1849.
Oh my gosh.
Oh.
Yeah, the shock on all of the girls' face. That would be like me and you. You know, we have a relationship, but it's certainly not that kind of a relationship. In fact, if you're a teenage girl and I'm a 49-year-old man, you should look at me more like a father figure than someone that you're interested in marrying. That's the natural order of things.
I don't.
Back then it was slightly less weird than it is today, but it's still weird. What's really kind of cool about it, though, because we talk about how horrible and evil slavery is, and yes, it is, but not all of it was always that bad. For instance, the owner of this young slave girl recognizes that these two are in love, so he gifts his slave girl to the Peter Blow family so that Dred Scott can marry her.
Oh.
That's pretty nice. The age is weird. Forget about the age. But just think about the nice gesture that was made so that these two people in love could be together. Peter Blow fails at farming and no longer needs a field hand, so he sells Scott and his wife to an army doctor named John Emerson. Army doctor.
Oh god.
This guy's stationed in Missouri.
Oh.
Free your slave. You know this. Missouri, free your slave. Slave, thank you. Dr. Emerson, because he's an army doctor, and someone in here inevitably will learn this if you decide to join the military someday, when the military tells you to go, you go. If you go to the army and they tell you we're going to station you in Antarctica, you can't say, I don't like the cold and I'm scared of penguins or whatever. No, you go there because you belong to the military. In fact, that's one of the reasons a lot of young people will join the military, is because you get some cool experiences traveling the world. You don't get to pick a lot of times where you go. You might have some say, but when the Army tells Dr. Emerson, we're moving you from Missouri to Illinois, Dr. Emerson packs up his stuff and goes to Illinois. Any problems there, people?
They're free.
Illinois is a free state, and Emerson has slaves. By the way, by this point, Dred Scott and his wife have had 2 children. 2 young boys. They will have 2 more children, 2 young girls that do not survive through childhood, which, if you're paying attention, is becoming a theme. When people have kids back then, not all of them live. Even today, we still have issues with this. You know, in the hospital my wife works at, once or twice a year, she has to attend a funeral because she works on that floor. She has to attend a funeral representing the hospital for all of the babies that don't make it. It's got to be horrible and sad and painful, and she hates that day. But she dresses all nice, and they bring flowers, and it's just awful because it's babies that don't. So even today, we still have issues, but not like that. So they moved to Illinois. They spent about 1.5 years in either Illinois or Wisconsin, just going about their stuff. And by the way, being a slave to an army doctor, if we're looking at levels of bad, probably isn't the worst, because what's your job? Like, go clean up that blood? Or there's some puke over there, go wipe it up? I don't know. I mean, I hate to say that there's such a thing as good slavery, but Emerson wasn't necessarily a bad man. Dred Scott's not whipped and beaten. He's allowed to live with his wife and his kids. So his life, as far as a slave life would go, was probably as good as it gets. They return back to Missouri because the army moves you around a lot. They go back to Missouri, and Dred Scott's talking to like his slave buddies, and they're like, "You idiot!" And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And they say, "There's this old law rule that says once free, always free." And because you were in Illinois, there is no slavery. You were a free man, and your wife was a free woman, and your children were free children. The same thing is true in Wisconsin. So Dred Scott is like, really? Dr. Emerson dies, by the way, and Scott is then given to Emerson's wife, his widow. If I pass away, all of my stuff will go to Mrs. Bellamy and my children. That's just kind of the natural order of things. So Dr. Emerson dies, and Scott decides to sue for his freedom because he learns about this once free, always free. So he's fighting for his freedom. And his case makes it in 1856 all the way to the United States Supreme Court. It takes 10 years to get through the court system to the point where someone is going to rule on whether Dred Scott is free or slave. Emerson's widow won't give him up. He's arguing for his freedom because he had been taken to free territories. The Supreme Court says, no, still a slave. The answer to this, any guesses why the Supreme Court rules against him? It's simple, but it's not simple. Most of the time people can't guess why. Anyone want to take a guess at why the Supreme Court says, no, you're still a slave, even though the law existed, once free, always free? That's a good answer. If you on the video, if you can't hear, she said it had been years past. Most laws have a limitation. It's called a statute of limitations, which means you have to sue in a certain amount of time, otherwise it goes away. It's a good answer, but it's not the right one. It's a great answer, actually. Because he was a slave. Are slaves citizens? Are slaves people? They don't consider them people. You and I are like, yeah, of course Dred Scott's a person. He looks like a person, he acts like a person, he talks like a person. Beetlejuice?
Yeah.
Was Beetlejuice a white guy?
No, I'll show you Beetlejuice.
Are you talking about the movie?
No.
I don't know. Anyway, he's not even a person. So when it goes to the United States Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
He's like, there's a video and he goes, how do you spell red? He goes, L-S-T-E-R. Red.
You guys just made me a little dumb.
Dig a 6 foot.
The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is this guy. His name's Roger Taney. It looks like Taney, but it's pronounced Taney. This is a pic of him. Kind of a droopy-looking guy. The Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices. But the Chief Justice is the one that gets to pick which court cases are going to be heard. So even today, every year, the Supreme Court, those 9 justices on the Supreme Court, are probably presented with hundreds of cases that they want to be heard. The Chief Justice picks which ones they're actually going to focus on and throws the rest of them out. Now, the Chief Justice isn't the sole picker, the only one that picks. So, like for instance, if I'm the Chief Justice, and there's one court case that Paul, he's just an associate justice, he's another one of the justices, really wants to be seen or heard in the court, Paul can come to me and say, Mr. Bellamy, Chief Justice, I would like us to take a look at this court case. And the Chief Justice will likely say, yes, let's take a look at that one. So just because those 8 other justices aren't in charge doesn't mean they don't have any authority. But Roger Taney refuses Dred Scott because he's not a citizen and therefore he can't use the court system. So it has nothing to do with slavery and freedom. He's saying that Dred Scott isn't a person. Roger Taney is a racist man. Roger Taney believed in slavery. He believed that you cannot take away a slaveholder's property. The Fifth Amendment protects my rights to my property. Therefore, Scott remains a slave. This also means the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, and it will take until the 14th Amendment, which gives slaves or ex-slaves citizenship before all of this is undone. So all of this, Dred Scott, like, woo, I can fight for freedom, in 10 years going through the court system to get to the Supreme Court, and he loses. It's like, this is the worst story you've ever told, Mr. Bellamy, but there's actually 2 other versions of this story. Once he's taken back into slavery, Mrs. Emerson, in the meantime, had remarried. and she remarried this guy named, I'm going to probably get this wrong, but it doesn't really matter because it's an obscure detail in history, Charles Chaffee. Charles Chaffee was an ardent abolitionist. Not like a crazy one, not like John Brown who would kill everyone to get rid of slavery, but Chaffee thinks slavery is awful, and when he finds out, it's like, you married this woman not realizing that she owns slaves? When he finds out that Mrs. Emerson, his new wife, is a slave owner, not only a slave owner, but she happens to own like the most prominent slave in all of America, he's like, honey, we got to get rid of these slaves. This is not okay. So there's two stories of how the Scots did get their freedom. One story says that Mrs. Emerson, the new Mrs. Chaffee, gifts them back to to Peter Blow family. Peter Blow is dead, but his family's still alive. So there must be some kind of a family relationship there. In the meantime, Peter Blow's family had turned into abolitionists, so they set them free. There's another story. Go stand at the stand-up desk if you can't stay awake. You gotta get your head up, go stand up. There's another story that says there's two old spinstresses in New York that hear about this. A spinstress is like an old lady that has a lot of money. Two of them, they'd never married, so they had their father's inheritance. That found out about this case and purchased the Scots and set them free. It doesn't really matter which story is accurate, but the Scots finally get their freedom, even though the courts deny it. They're like, woohoo! For 17 months, Dred Scott is a free man working as a porter. A porter's like a baggage carrier. You go to a fancy hotel and you walk in and someone comes up and takes your suitcases and carries them to your room. What do they want from you?
Money.
They want a tip, and you should tip them. If you don't want to give them a tip and carry your own bags, sometimes they'll argue about that, but a couple bucks is no big deal. That's how they make their money, so you should tip them. For 17 months, he's a free man. And then he dies of tuberculosis. It's like all of that work to get free, and you didn't get to enjoy any of it. Okay, so that's the Dred Scott case. This is Abraham Lincoln. And this is Stephen Douglas. If you remember, I introduced Stephen Douglas to you the other day. I said Stephen Douglas's nickname was Little Giant because he was only 5'4", but he was powerful. Stephen Douglas was one of those men in the room when Charles Sumner was giving his speech, and Douglas was leaning against the wall, and Charles Sumner says some mean things about Douglas, and Douglas looks at the guy next to him and says, that damn fool's going to get himself killed by some other damn fool. So Douglas has been around. He's a big deal. He's a powerful man. Abraham Lincoln is a nobody. So we talked about his prowess as a wrestler and how great of a wrestler he was. But what did I do with my paper?
This one.
You stole it, Paul?
God dang it, Paul. You and that new
Yes, thank you. Just to give you some background, just to paint the picture of Abraham Lincoln. He's the tallest ever American president, 6'4". Donald Trump claims to be 6'4", but people argue that he's not actually 6'4". Maybe he was at some point, but old people sort of get a hump and then they show. I don't know. 6'4". At 6'4", he weighed $180, so he was a scrawny looking dude. No college. 1 year of formal education. So the guy only went to school for 1 year. I don't know. I never have read that.
Learn how to eat ranch.
But it also tells us a lot about the guy, that if he's smart enough to be the president of the United States, and there's tons of quotes that are attributed to him, and they all are flowery. And one of the powers that Abraham Lincoln had is when he spoke, everybody listened. Even his opponents listened, because when he said something, it was so thoughtful, they had no choice but to pay attention. He earned at one point the military rank of captain. By the way, the tallest president, 6'4". The shortest president in U.S. history was James Madison at 5'4". Stephen Douglas is also 5'4", which tells us Stephen Douglas is not going to win the presidency. This particular set of debate is for the Illinois Senate seat in 1858. So this isn't the presidential election. We'll see that in a minute. Lincoln marries a woman named Mary Todd. She's above his class. Like Abraham Lincoln has to ask her father multiple times for an opportunity to marry his daughter because Mary Todd is too good for him. This is just some guy with no education. Mary Todd's family is fairly wealthy. Mary saw something in Abraham that probably no one else could see. She's the driving force behind all of his success politically. She's the one telling him, run for political office. You are smarter, you are better, you are stronger, you are the man.
You are him.
She's the reason why he is him. They have 4 children together. Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, 4 boys. 3 of them died before Abe. Again, the heartbreak that must have been life back then, it happens to us today, but back then it was much more common. They're running for House of Representatives in this Illinois state legislature. A couple other factoids. Abraham Lincoln wore a top hat like the one you see here in his picture. He used to hide money and mail inside his top hat. So Lincoln wasn't a drinker. So I doubt that's true, but I guess anything could happen. But he hid stuff in his hat. He believed it to be safer than his pockets. Had lots of jobs growing up. He was a hard worker. Was a riverboat pilot at one point. Was a rail splitter, so he would take trees and split them into fence rails. He was a self-taught lawyer, so with no education, gets a law degree. You could do that today, theoretically. To become a lawyer, you have to pass a test called an LSAT. Maybe that's to get into law school. You have to pass a pretty rigorous test. But if you decide you want to go into law, your path to becoming a lawyer is probably a 4-year bachelor's degree and then 3 more years of college for what's called a Juris Doctorate. It's a long 7-year process to become a lawyer. He had no schooling. So the dude is super smart. His hat size was 7 1/8. If any of you have ever purchased a fitted hat, that's not very big. Like my gigantic cabeza is a 7 5/8, so it's a full ½ inch bigger than Abraham Lincoln's head. And you'd think because he was 6'4" and a giant of the time that he would have had a big head. He wore size 14 shoes.
Isaiah.
Pretty
Yeah,
big kicks.
Isaiah.
Is that what Isaiah wears?
Yeah.
He preferred people call him Lincoln. He didn't like Abe or Abraham. So people that were connected to him just called him plain Lincoln. And his pay for president was $25,000 a year, which is more money than he'd ever made doing anything in his life. And it wasn't enough for Mary. Mary was, after going through the loss of a couple of her kids, Mary was messed up here. And she's married to what will become the President of the United States during probably the toughest time in American history. So I'm going to guess Abraham Lincoln probably did not have much time for his wife, and she really needed him because the guy's trying to pull a country back together that's fallen apart. So this guy's got a tough situation. And if you remind me, after your test on Thursday, I'll tell you a story about why he grew a beard. In fact, if you look at Abraham Lincoln's face, kind of sunken in and hollow, and his size being a giant, many people believe, and this can't be proven because he's dead, that he suffered from a rare disease called Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome is also called the giant disease.
Didn't Andre the Giant have
Yeah, if you know, if you've ever seen the movie Princess Bride or you've ever watched professional wrestling with Andre the Giant, he suffered from Marfan's. Usually don't survive much past your mid-40s because your body doesn't stop growing and especially your heart doesn't stop growing. Eventually it just won't work. But if you've ever seen images of Andre the Giant, obviously he's much bigger than Abraham Lincoln, but Andre the Giant had drug and alcohol issues also, which probably sped up his death. But giant, just enormous human. So he could have had some of those characteristics. Anyway, he's nominated by Republicans, and he said that all Democrats wanted to legalize slavery in all states, which is probably a little bit of a exaggeration, a stretch. Because even his opponent here, Stephen Douglas didn't love slavery. He just was a firm believer in popular sovereignty. Let the people pick. Let the states choose. It's not the federal government's authority, or it shouldn't be the federal government's authority to determine whether your state is free or slave. And then Abraham Lincoln's famous quote, running into the election of 1858 and the election of 1860, he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." So a country that's divided, and we see divisiveness in our country all over the place today, will not survive. Abraham Lincoln's a smart man. He ends up losing this election in 1858, but now everybody knows who he is. He's famous. It's sort of like, I think one of the biggest problems with our political system today, we can't ever just elect an average, ordinary guy or girl. It's got to be someone that has a lot of wealth or fame. Like, maybe I'd be the greatest candidate for president of the United States. The problem is, in this entire world, there's maybe 3,000 or 5,000 people that know who I am. And of them, not all of them would vote for me. So how do I get the rest of the world to know who I am? I got to put an ad on during the Super Bowl or something, or on television, or I got to get it on the late night talk shows. In order to do that requires a lot of money, and I don't have that. So even though our goal, our desire might be to elect someone that's like us, because I know what problems you guys are going through, because I'm one of you. I've lived through what you've lived through. Did Donald Trump or Joe Biden ever go through the problems that you and I face on a daily basis? I don't think so, because they were born wealthy. Now, some of you are like, I don't really have any problems. Well, yeah, maybe our problems are pretty small. Some people have lots of problems, like worrying about paying rent, or the car won't start, and we don't have any money to fix the car. Those are issues that ordinary, everyday people deal with. But I don't think probably President Trump has ever had to, or President Biden has ever had to. So there's an appeal to a regular guy with no education that grew up in the middle of nowhere. People like the folksy style of him. We might prefer it today, but I don't think we're ever going to get that option. Stephen Douglas, sponsor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is Abraham Lincoln's actual hat. It's not quite as pretty as the one in the picture over here. It is beaver fell. So remember we talked about the fur trade. It's not an expensive one. Lincoln was not a wealthy man. It's the best he could afford. In fact, can you imagine a president wearing something this scruffy looking? Those are his slippers. Anybody see anything on those slippers that's kind of ironic?
Blood.
Oh, the horn.
There's a goat on them. President Lincoln wore slippers with a goat on them,
And he's the goat?
and he's the goat. I think that's pretty cool. Was that a thing back then? No. Those are both on display at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. So those of you that were with me in May in Washington, you may have seen them on display. That museum was gigantic, and I know we didn't spend a ton of time there, but I went and checked them out. Tried to figure out if there's any way I could get them. And then I realized if he wore size 14 slippers, they probably aren't going to fit me very good anyway. So, and they really don't look that comfy.
Is that an apple on the side?
An apple.
Like right on the side?
Oh, like here? I
Yeah.
don't know what that is.
Like,
By the way, let me show you. This is kind of comical. If you look at the door frame over here, and if you're listening to this video on the computer, look at the door frame in my classroom. Some of you probably noticed there's some marks on the door here. And maybe nobody's ever asked me, but you're like, what the heck? Okay, so this one here is 5'4". This is the top of Stephen Douglas's head, the little giant. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". This is the top of his head. His top hat measures 8 and some odd inches tall. This is the top of Abraham Lincoln's top hat. So if you can imagine Abraham Lincoln wearing his top hat standing next to Stephen Douglas, it would have been almost comical. I think it would have been funny seeing it, but anyway, that's why those marks are there, and only for that fleeting moment of discussion about that. This is a debate between Lincoln and Douglas for the Illinois Senate seat, so please watch.
We have now heard the leading arguments of the two candidates for the high office of United States Senator from Illinois, Judge Stephen A. Douglas and Mr. Abraham Lincoln. Each of the candidates will now speak in rebuttal. Judge Douglas. fellow citizens, my good friend Mr. Lincoln has addressed you with his usual artless sincerity, his pure homely charm, his perennial native humor. Like Brutus in Shakespeare's immortal tragedy, Mr. Lincoln is an honorable man. But also like Brutus, he is an adept at the art of inserting daggers between an opponent's ribs, just when said opponent least expects it. Behold me, ladies and gentlemen, I am covered with scars. Mr. Lincoln harps constantly on this subject of equality. He repeats over and over the argument used by Lovejoy and other abolitionists, to wit, that the Declaration of Independence, having declared all men free and equal by divine law, thus Negro equality, is an inalienable right. Contrary to this stands the verdict of the Supreme Court in the case of Dred Scott. Mr. Lincoln is a lawyer, and I presume, therefore, that he knows that when he seeks to destroy public confidence in the integrity, the inviolability of the Supreme Court, he is preaching revolution. He asks me to state my opinion of the Dred Scott decision, and I answer him unequivocally by saying I take the decisions of the Supreme Court to be the law of the land, and I intend to obey them as such. Now, will I be swayed from that position by all the ranting of all the fanatics who preach racial equality, who would ask us to vote, eat, sleep, and marry with Negroes? And I say further, let each state mind its own business and leave its neighbors alone. If we'll stand on that principle, Mr. Lincoln will find that this great republic can exist, forever divided into free and slave states, and we can go on, as we have done, increasing in wealth, in population, in power, until we shall become the admiration and the terror of the world. Mr. Abraham Lincoln.
You've heard the judge make allusion to those who advocate voting and eating and marrying and sleeping with Negroes. Whether he meant me specifically, I do not know. If he did, I can only say that just because I do not want a colored woman for a slave, I do not necessarily want her for a wife. I do not need to have her for either. I can just leave her alone. In some respects, she is certainly not my equal any more than I am the judge's equal in some respects. But in her natural right to eat the bread she earns with her own hands without asking leave of somebody else, she is my equal and the equal of all others. The purpose of the Dred Scott decision is to make property and nothing but property of the Negro in all states of the Union. As a nation, we began by declaring all men are created equal. There was no mention of any exception to that rule in the Declaration of Independence. But we now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. What is to stop us in future from decreeing, all men are created equal except Negroes, foreigners, Catholics, Jews, or just poor people? This is the complacent policy of indifference to evil. And that policy I cannot but hate. I hate it because it deprives our republic of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions everywhere to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity. In his final words tonight, the judge said that we can be the terror of the world. I don't think we want to be that. I think we would prefer to be the encouragement of the world, the proof that at last man is worthy to be free. But we shall provide no such encouragement unless we can establish our ability as a nation to live and grow. And we shall surely do neither if these States fail to remain united. There can be no distinction in the definition of liberty as between one section and another, one class and another, one race and another. A house divided against itself cannot stand. This government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free.
First of all, remember that's a guy with no education.
That's not.
And he could get up and talk in a speech the way he could get up and talk in a speech. It's crazy to think that there's a guy that's that intelligent.
Was it actually him, like in the video?
No,
Oh my god.
there were no movies in 1860 or
I was just
1858.
making sure.
That is from a movie. I don't remember the name of the movie, but it's the wording is supposed to be accurate. And what's different about debates then and now? Because we will at some point see a debate, whether it's between President Trump and Nikki Haley running for the Republican nomination for president, or eventually maybe it's President Trump and President Biden, though they one of them prefers to avoid that as much as possible. But we will see that debate, and they're not near as civil to each other. Civil means like kind. In fact, you sit there and you saw when Stephen Douglas was talking about all the bad things about Abraham Lincoln, what was Abraham Lincoln doing? Just sitting there, maybe taking some notes. And then when Lincoln stands up and it's his turn to talk, Stephen Douglas was just sitting there. That's how debates are supposed to work. And then they would give them time afterward to rebut or give a final statement. And then the other guy gets the time to give a final statement. And that's how debates work. And then the people choose the winner. Also, think about the difficulty of that debate. You're outside in like a town square, maybe in a city park, and there's hundreds of people around. No microphone. How do you really talk loud enough that the people can actually hear what's going on? Just the ambiance of the crowd noise. Ambiance maybe isn't the right word. The crowd noise, just from people shuffling around. Or your cell phone's going off. Okay, maybe they didn't have that issue. But all those things would make it really difficult to hear what they had to say anyway. But when Abraham Lincoln runs for president in 1860, a mistake takes place. He's running against the same guy, Stephen Douglas, but the Democrat Party splits. Northern Democrats choose Stephen Douglas to represent them, and Southern Democrats choose a different candidate named John Breckinridge to represent them. Okay, so just based on what you know, Abraham Lincoln being a Republican and we've got two Democrats, what's going to be the outcome of this election? Who wins?
Abraham.
Why? How? How do you know that? I haven't even talked about that yet.
He's on our president board.
Oh, because he's on the wall as a president? But there's another way to tell, just based on the information right here in this slide, who's going to win? Haley?
Abraham, because there's more Republicans voting for him.
Yes, and not even half the country is Republican, but it's kind of that way. If I just use today's, if President Trump is the Republican nominee, and half the Democrats believe that it should be Joe Biden, and the other half of the Democrats think that it should be the governor of California. His name's Gavin Newsom, who seems to be one of the favorites if the Democrats decide to pull the plug on Biden, because he's got some issues. And then there could be another Republican too, because Nikki Haley hasn't gone away. Right now, I think she's kind of hoping, for her sake, that Donald Trump is in jail, because if he's in jail for some of these crimes that he's been accused of, all of a sudden she's the next person in line. So that's why she's still sticking around. She keeps losing to him, but it won't matter in November if the guy can't even be eligible. So they stick around for a reason, but this is a big mistake. So the Democrats are going to split their vote. Half of them are going to vote for Stephen Douglas, and half of them are going to vote for John Breckinridge. Then we throw into that, there's actually another political party called the Constitutional Party that nominated a guy named John Bell. So there are 4 candidates. We're used to 2. And actually, when you go vote, when you turn 18, excuse me, there will probably be 4 or 5 different candidates, most of them you've never heard of, on the ballot. That's normal for us. But those other 2 or 3, they get a handful of votes, but mostly the people that vote for them are just frustrated with the 2 main candidates, the Republican and the Democrat. So it's a splinter, the Democrats versus the Republicans, and this is what the outcome looks like in the Electoral College. So we choose the President of the United States, and we'll go into greater detail on this at a later time, based on the vote of the Electoral College, not the vote of the people. Our vote in Nebraska, for instance, is supposed to tell a group of men and women called the electors who we want them to vote for. And then we send them to Washington in December, and they're supposed to cast their votes for who the people of the state of Nebraska told them to. So when you look at the numbers in each of these states, Minnesota here has 4 electors. New York has 35. Pennsylvania has 27. Georgia has 10. Anybody see a problem with where most of the electoral votes are? They're in the northern states, who are more likely to support a candidate that is anti-slavery. Abraham Lincoln's benefit here. Nebraska, by the way, has 5 electors. It's not a very big state. It's based on the size of your population. Does anybody know which state today has the most electors in the Electoral College? What did you say? It is California. I believe it's 53 or 54. So if you're a candidate, are you going to spend a whole lot of time campaigning in a place like Nebraska? No, it's not worth a whole lot. You're going to spend most of your time campaigning in those states that have lots of electors that aren't already decided. Like, for instance, Donald Trump probably won't spend a whole lot of time in California, even though it's got 53 or 54 electoral votes, because California most likely is going to vote for the Democrat. Probably Joe Biden won't spend a ton of time in Texas. Texas has the 2nd most electoral votes, and it will most likely vote for the Republican. Could that change? Yes. Florida can go back and forth, but it's more likely to vote for the Republicans. So they're going to fight over Florida a little bit, but they're going to spend most of their time in states that are purple. They're not blue and they're not red. So like Ohio goes back and forth in every election. Pennsylvania can go either way. Those are big prize states. Wisconsin can go either way. Michigan could go either way. Minnesota likely is Democrat. South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, most likely Republican. So those candidates know where their bread is buttered. You could see candidates spending some time in Nebraska, not necessarily because they think they need to, but because Nebraska per capita has like the largest number of millionaires in the country. So there's a lot of money in the state of Nebraska. Warren Buffett lives in Omaha, and he's one of the richest men on the planet. So yeah, and a lot of those people that joined into business with Warren Buffett when he was young followed him to super wealth. So there's a lot of super rich people in Omaha. So candidates will go there, not necessarily because they need a campaign, but because they need donors. And the super rich are good places to get donations to help run your campaign. But when we look at this, we see Abraham Lincoln gets 180 electoral votes. All those dark pink or red states vote for him. John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, gets all the South, 72 electoral votes. John Bell, the constitutional candidate, gets those 3 states. And then Stephen Douglas only gets Missouri and half of New Jersey. So the vote is split, and as a result, Abraham Lincoln becomes the president. Here's another electoral college map that looks just like the other one. There's also a bit of a problem that we see here. Slave state that doesn't vote with Breckinridge, Missouri. Kentucky, slave or free? Slave. Virginia, slave or free? Slave. Maryland and Delaware, both slave. And they don't all side together on the same side. Even if you added them up, though, even if we took all of the electoral votes that Bell and Breckinridge and Douglas got, they still can't catch Lincoln because it's based on the Electoral College. And all these southern states have small populations because they're all rural. There aren't any major cities in them. So the southern states really feel like their vote didn't matter. And then look at the popular vote. Popular vote just means how did the people actually vote? If we add up the votes that Douglas got and Breckinridge and Bell got, total, they got more votes than Abraham Lincoln. We don't have to look at very many points in history to see this happen. When President Trump defeated Hillary Clinton a few years ago for president, in his first term as president, Hillary Clinton had more people in America vote for her, but she lost the electoral vote. By the way, the electoral vote exists because the men who wrote the Constitution years and years ago were worried that the average American citizen might not be smart enough to make these decisions, so the electors should do it. So every December, every 4 years, when Nebraska sends electors to Washington, D.C., and we tell those 5 men or women who to vote for, when they get to Washington, by law, they don't have to do what we told them. They can vote for whoever they choose. Do they change? No, not very often. Because if Donald Trump wins the state of Nebraska, he may or may not, then the Republican Party gets to pick those 5 electors. Are they going to send somebody to D.C. that's not going to represent the state the way they're supposed to? No. So it doesn't happen. But anyway, this is a screwy thing. As a result, all of those southern states are angry. They're like, our vote didn't even matter. And they're not wrong. So Abraham Lincoln is going to become the president. When Lincoln gets elected, the southern states felt their vote didn't count, so some of them decided to secede. The word secede means to withdraw. They're just going to leave. They don't want to be part of the United States anymore. They had said, if you elect Abraham Lincoln, we're out. Abraham Lincoln says, if you elect me, I promise I won't abolish slavery. He's trying to keep both sides happy. Remember, he doesn't want the house divided. He wants to keep everyone on the same side. South Carolina, this is on your study guide, is the first state to go. I told you last week of all the states, South Carolina was the slaviest of the slave states. And they formed their own country called the Confederate States of America, and they elected this guy,
Owning slaves is
Jefferson Davis, as their president. So we got the USA and the CSA, and America is divided. Now President Lincoln, as he steps into the office of the presidency, has to figure out how to bring it back together. Not an easy task. When you look at this, how many minutes do we have, peeps? Okay, good. Do I need to go back here for just a minute? Some of you are still clicking away. I do like Jefferson Davis's goatee and his hair, but I still think if I could pick, I'd have a big poofy afro. I would look good with big poofy hair. Like my poofy hair would make Wyatt's poofy hair look weak.
But you don't have hair.
I know, but if I did, is what I'm saying. If I rubbed a magic lantern and got 3 wishes,
First one would be big poofy afro.
maybe. There's a lot of advantages to not having any hair. Like, I don't know.
okay, don't shave. Just don't shave.
Dude, if I
Get
don't shave,
sunburn on your
I
head.
look like a dandelion right before the wind poops it away. Looks silly.
Just do it and then let it grow out.
No, that's not the way the world works.
You shouldn't have just went bald in the first place.
Yeah, right. Okay, the Confederate States of America versus the United States of America. There's one state here. Look at Virginia. What's wrong with Virginia? Anybody catch this? Or what's missing, maybe? West Virginia. West Virginia only exists because there were, I'm probably wrong in the number, 62 counties in the western part of Virginia that refused to secede. So West Virginia, those 62 counties, broke away from Virginia, created their own state, which was a slave state and remained loyal to the Union. West Virginia becomes a state because of the Civil War. Other problems that we see up here. If you notice the location of Washington, D.C., it's right on the border of Virginia and Maryland. Both are slave states. Delaware is a slave state. The capital of the United States is located in slave territory right on the border of the Confederacy and the United States. Maryland being a slave state, if Abraham Lincoln steps up and says, no more slavery, what's Maryland going to do? It's going to secede also, which puts the capital of the United States in Confederate territory. Does that work to have the capital of your country in another country?
No.
So they better have backup plans for this, or Abraham Lincoln has to be really, really careful about who he ticks off, because he cannot afford to lose Maryland and Delaware without losing his capital. So this whole thing is going to be complex, which is what chapter 16 is. It's not super easy. The North believes that secession is unconstitutional, that the southern states don't have the power to withdraw from the United States. They might be right. Abraham Lincoln believes that. Therefore, the Confederate States of America is never actually acknowledged by anybody in the world as its own country. The United States doesn't acknowledge it, and no other countries do. They get close, which is part of chapter 16. The British and the French consider it. Any ideas why another country might consider acknowledging that the CSA is a country? What do they have that the rest of the world really would like? Cotton and tobacco. Trade. So some countries are like, maybe we should. No, they're losing. Oh, they're winning. Okay, so back and forth they go. When Lincoln gets inaugurated, he tells the South, I promise I won't abolish slavery if you stick around. He speaks against secession. And remember, this guy with no education, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell with the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be by the better nature of our better angels of our nature. A guy with no education can talk that flowery. By the way, I told you I will tell you a story about why Abraham Lincoln grew a beard. It's kind of a fun story. It's short. It won't take me very long. But that'll be after your test on Thursday. That'll be our plan. And then when he gets inaugurated, swears in, hand on the Bible, takes an oath. One woman remarks, there goes that Illinois ape, the cursed abolitionist, but he will never come back alive. So immediately upon taking the office of the presidency, there are threats to Abraham Lincoln's life. This guy has got his hands full. One, his wife is a little cray-cray. Two, he's got 3 sons that are going to die. The 4th son, the one that doesn't die, is actually enlisted. He goes to fight in the war against his father's wishes. And he's got to bring the country back together all at the same time. What a mess. This guy can handle stress better than any of us. Here's Lincoln during his inauguration. And there's also Bernie Sanders watching Lincoln's inauguration.
What?
He was actually there.
What about
President
Stephen Hawking?
Biden was there too. He's saying all weird stuff. Mrs. Trulin was out here in the audience. She wasn't sitting
I
up
can tell why he's not up on the top level, Biden, because he
there.
can't.
You know, Mrs. Castro dismisses it because she's not quite around yet. Most everyone knows that war is inevitable.
Stop! I'll be in paradise.
You'll be in.
Oh yeah, you're going to Jamaica, right?